Chapter 1. Winds of Winter. Addie Walker knew that winter had come to Philadelphia even before she opened her eyes. An icy wind whistled through the crack in the garret window. Mama had just gotten up, letting a puff of cold air in the bed when she lifted the heavy quilt. But her place was still warm, so Addie snuggled into it. Mama's gentle voice called to her. "Addie, honey, I need your help over here. Snow is coming right in through the window." Addie peeked out from under the quilt. In the dim gray light of morning, she saw Mama straining to close the window. Its panes were white with frost. A little pile of snow had built up on the windowsill, and more snow had blown across the floor. "I'm coming, Mama," she said. Addie crawled out of bed and shivered over to the window to help Mama. Together they pulled down on the window, struggling to close it, but the window wouldn't budge. "Go get them rags next to the stove," Mama said. Addie got the rags and returned to Mama. "Help me stuff these in the crack, Addie," said Mama, as she poked the rags between the window and the sill. "Stuff them good. They all we got to keep the wind from coming in." Addie put one cold foot on top of the other to try to warm up her feet. "Can't we light the stove this morning, Mama?" she asked. "It's so cold in here." "No, honey," Mama said. "We got just enough coal to last us the week if we use it only for cooking supper." She smiled at Addie and gave her a quick, warm hug. "Now you wash up and get ready for school, and hustle, you hear? Then you won't feel the cold so bad." Addie splashed icy cold water from the basin over her face and dressed quickly, dancing around in her stocking feet. She waited to pull on her boots until the very end. They were still wet from the puddle she had stepped in on her way home from school yesterday. Though she had set them by the stove last night, the fire hadn't been warm long enough to dry them out. Addie wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and sat down at the table to eat the cornbread Mama had set out for her. She crumbled it in a bowl and poured buttermilk over it. As she ate, she spied a pile of fabric folded neatly on Mama's chair, with a spool of thread and a pair of scissors on top. "You was up late again sewing, Mama, wasn't you?" asked Addie. "I got to finish this dress for Mrs. Howell," answered Mama. "Mrs. Ford say Mrs. Howell is real particular." Mama unfolded the fabric and squinted at one of the seams she had sewn last night. "It's hard to see my stitches by candlelight. We sure do need a lamp." "How much we got saved for it?" asked Addie. "Can I count up the money in the milk bottle again?" Mama nodded. "Sure you can," she said, "but I ain't put nothing in since you counted it last week." "I put my tips in last Saturday, Mama," Addie said proudly. "I got 2 big tips when I delivered them dresses to Society Hill for Mrs. Ford." "That's good, Addie," said Mama. She reached into their hiding place behind the stove, picked up the milk bottle, and handed it to Addie. Addie turned the bottle upside down and shook it so that the coins poured out. Then she carefully counted the pennies, half-dimes, and dimes. "We got $1.57, announced Addie. "Well, that ain't enough for a lamp," said Mama. "Guess we're gonna have to wait a little longer. Just hope I don't have to pull them stitches out of one of them seams in that dress." Addie finished her breakfast and washed her bowl and spoon in the bucket of water that stood by the stove. Then she sat back down so Mama could brush and braid her hair. She looked at the thick folds of green and red plaid taffeta that lay over the chair next to her. "Them rich girls sure got pretty dresses," said Addie. "Sure do," said Mama. "Isabella Howell's gonna wear that one to some fancy Christmas party." "Remember last Christmas, Mama?" asked Addie. She thought back to last year when she and Mama were on the plantation with Papa, her brother Sam, and baby sister Esther. "Master Stevens gave us a real skinny chicken. Sam wouldn't even eat it after you cooked it. He was mad because of how hard we worked. He said one chicken couldn't make up for a whole year work, but I was hungry, and I ate it." "I remember," Mama said. "But Sam ate my sweet potato pudding. He liked that." "And Papa did, too," Addie said. "Sweet potato pudding was Papa's favorite. He always said so. He always—" Addy stopped. She and Mama did not even know where Papa and Sam were, and they had to leave baby Esther behind when they ran away from the plantation. She missed Papa and Sam and Esther so much. Mama seemed to know just what Addy was feeling. As she started to braid Addy's hair, she said, "I'm going to make that pudding for Christmas again this year. We'll take it to the church dinner. Auntie Lula taught me to make it. I'm sure she's going to be making it this year, too. So when we have Christmas dinner, we'll be eating the same thing as Auntie Lula, Uncle Solomon, and Esther." "I wonder what Esther's Christmas is going to be like," worried Addy. "Well, Auntie Lula and Uncle Solomon ain't going to have to work on Christmas, so they can be with her all day long," said Mama. She finished Addy's first braid and started on the second one. "And you left your doll Janie with her. That's like Esther having a present to play with every day." "Last night I dreamed we was all together, Sam, Papa, Esther, all of us here in Philadelphia," said Addy. She turned her head to look at Mama, who looked sad. Mama gently turned Addy's head back and continued braiding. "It ain't gonna be just a dream, Mama. It's really gonna happen someday, ain't it?" Addy asked hopefully. "Ain't we all gonna be together someday?" "Someday, honey. Someday. That dream keep me going. That and your bright face." Mama finished the second braid and leaned over to kiss the top of Addy's head. On the way to school that morning, Addy asked her friend Sarah what Christmas was like in Freedom. Sarah described the celebration at church. "I hope it's going to be just like last year," said Sarah. "The altar was all decorated with pine branches. In the middle was a manger with baby Jesus and Mary and Joseph kneeling next to it. There was 3 wise men and a bunch of angels and even a silvery star hanging from the ceiling. Lots of candles was on the altar. The whole church was glowing and beautiful. I'm telling you, Addy, it's the prettiest thing you'll ever see. Ever." Addy could barely imagine something so lovely. Sarah went on. "After the service, we go downstairs for the big Christmas dinner. Everybody brings something to share, and everyone in the whole church sit down like one great big family. Mama said we was going to bring sweet potato pudding, just like we had last year for Christmas," said Addy. That sounds good," said Sarah brightly. "But I ain't told you the best part yet, Addy. After dinner, there's a special shadow play for children." "What's that?" asked Addy. "Well, it's kind of hard to describe," said Sarah. "We sit in a dark room that has this big sheet hanging in the front. Behind it, there's this bright lamp. People in front of the lamp make shadows on the sheet. They act out the Christmas story while it's read out loud." "I bet it's real nice," Addy said. "You gonna love it," Sarah said excitedly. "And this year my mama's letting me sing in the children's choir. You should join too. We practice every Saturday till Christmas." "I wish I could, but I can't," said Addy. "Saturday is when I work for Mrs. Ford. I'm doing errands and deliveries so she and Mama can spend all their time sewing Christmas dresses for the customers. Mrs. Ford let me keep the tips from the deliveries. I had to promise I would keep up with my lessons." "What are you going to do with your money?" asked Sarah. "Mama and me saving for a lamp," answered Addy. "Maybe by the time I finish all the Christmas deliveries, we might have enough saved up." "Well, don't worry, Addy," said Sarah kindly. "If you can't come to choir practice, I'll teach you the songs. Then you can sing on Christmas along with everyone else." "I'd like that," said Addy. She smiled at her friend. "We can start right now," said Sarah. "The first song we always sing is Joy to the World. Here's how it goes." With that, Sarah began to sing. Addy listened and then hummed along. Soon she knew the words. "Joy to the world," the 2 girls sang together as they hurried through the winter streets to school. Chapter 2. Something Pretty. Early on Saturday morning, Addy set out on her errands and deliveries for Mrs. Ford. She brought a bill to a customer on Society Hill. Then she went to the dry goods store a few blocks away to pick up supplies that Mrs. Ford had ordered. The thread, buttons, ribbon, and fringe were wrapped into one parcel before Addy left the store. Addy held on to her parcel tightly as she stepped around the slush and dirty puddles in the streets. On the way to her next stop, she passed the windows of Mr. Del Monte's second-hand shop. Sometimes she and Mama went there to look for clothes or pots and pans. The socks Addy had on today had come from Mr. Del Monte's. There was a small darn in the heel of one sock, but the other was as good as new. Addy stopped for a minute to look in the window. Lying among the used shoes, wool caps, and old belts was a bright patch of red cloth. It looked like the corner of a scarf, but most of it was hidden behind a rusty tea kettle. Addy went inside to take a closer look. Mr. Del Monte recognized her right away.
"Good morning, Addy,"
he said in his jolly way.
"What brings you here today?"
"Can I see that red scarf in the window?" Addy asked. Mr. Del Monte reached into the window display and moved the tea kettle so he could lift out the scarf and hand it to Addy.
"It's a beauty," he said. "Hardly looks worn."
Addy unfolded the scarf. It was like new. The red fabric was soft and smooth. Addy held it up to her cheek. Right then she knew she wanted Mama to have the scarf. Mama should have something pretty like this, thought Addy. She worked so hard. She'd look so beautiful in this when we go to the Christmas service at church. Addy was almost afraid to ask about the price, but she looked up at Mr. Del Monte. "How much it cost?" she asked.
20 cents, answered Mr. Del Monte. "It's a good price for something that looks like it's never been worn."
Addy was discouraged. She didn't have 20 cents, but she had to buy that scarf somehow. "Please, Mr. Del Monte," she said, "could you put it away from me? I'm going to try my best to get the money to buy it."
"Well, I'll put it back behind that rusty kettle again," answered Mr. Del Monte. "You're the only person who spotted it since I put it in the window last week. It'll probably stay there a little longer."
"I hope so," said Addy, as she carefully folded the scarf and handed it back to Mr. Del Monte. The feel of the soft material and its bright red color stayed in Addy's mind as she headed back to Mrs. Ford's shop. "How am I going to get 20 cents?" she wondered. Back at the shop, Mrs. Ford had 3 packages for her to deliver, all wrapped in brown paper. "These go to Society Hill," said Mrs. Ford, as she handed them to Addy. "Be careful. Don't splash mud on them." "Yes, ma'am," said Addy. The streets were busier that afternoon than they were in the morning. Addy had to dodge around throngs of people bustling in and out of shops. Her packages were clumsy, and she worried about dropping them on the sloppy sidewalks. After Mama had worked so hard, Addy wanted to make sure the dresses were delivered in perfect condition. The last delivery was on Spruce Street. As Addy walked toward the address, she saw an old man lighting the street lamps. The lamps cast a golden glow on the wet sidewalks. When Addy got to the house, she rang the bell and waited for the big door to open. A maid finally came, and Addy handed her the last bundle. "This is from Mrs. Ford's shop," she said proudly. The maid took the package and handed Addy 5 pennies. Addy thanked her and turned away. As she walked back down Spruce Street, she curled her fingers around the coins inside her mitten. Suddenly, Addy had an idea. She decided to stop by Mr. Del Monte's shop again on the way home, just to be sure the soft red scarf was still there. As she approached the store, Mr. Del Monte was just locking up. "Don't worry, Addy," he said. "The scarf is still here. I moved it off in the corner a bit, but you can see it if you know where to look." The 2 of them stood at the window together. Mr. Del Monte headed down the street, but Addy stayed at the window, thinking about her idea. "If I put half my tips in the milk bottle," she thought, "and keep the other half, maybe I can save enough money to buy the scarf for Mama." Addy lingered a little longer, staring at the scarf in the fading light, thinking how pretty Mama would look in it. Then she headed back to Mrs. Ford's shop. By the time she got to the shop, her feet were numb with cold, and her nose felt frozen. "You look frozen stiff, child," said Mrs. Ford, peering above her spectacles. Mrs. Ford had a tape measure draped around her neck. Mama had a ribbon thrown across one shoulder as she sewed fringe on the end of a sash. They looked busy, and Addy knew she shouldn't bother them. "Mama, can I light the stove upstairs now?" asked Addy. "Please?" "No, Addy," Mama answered. "You know we don't light the stove until I start cooking supper. You head on upstairs. I'll be up as soon as I finish this sash. Then we'll light the stove." "Yes, Mama," said Addy. As she headed out the door, she heard Mrs. Ford ask Mama, "How is everything up in the garret?" "Everything is fine," Mama answered quickly. "We get by." Addy wanted to turn around and tell Mrs. Ford the truth, that it was freezing in the garret, and dark, and sometimes very lonely. On the plantation, Addy had been allowed to spend more time with Mama than she was here. She wanted to tell Mrs. Ford about the broken window and the snow on the floor, but Addy knew Mama would not want her to complain. "We get by," Addy said softly to herself as she climbed the stairs. When she got to the top, she lit the candle on the table. Addy turned her mitten upside down and let her tip money fall onto the table. She brought the milk bottle out from behind the stove and set it next to the money. Then Addy went over to the bed and lifted up a corner of the mattress. There she found the kerchief that she had brought from the plantation when she and Mama had escaped from slavery. Tied in one corner was the half-dime Uncle Solomon had given her. It was the only money they had when they headed north for freedom. "Freedom's got a cost," Uncle Solomon had said when he gave it to Addy. She had saved it for something very special, something important. Addy brought the kerchief over to the table and divided her tip money into 2 piles. She dropped one pile into the milk bottle and then carefully tied the other coins into the corner of her kerchief. With Uncle Solomon's half-dime, she had 10 cents in the kerchief. That was half of what she needed for Mama's red scarf. "I'm halfway there," Addy thought to herself. The thought made her so happy she didn't think about the cold. Chapter 3. Freedom Ain't Free. At church the next morning, Mama and Addy sat side by side in the women's section. Addy looked across the aisle where all the men sat and imagined that someday her papa would be sitting over there, smiling and giving her a wink that said, "You my favorite girl." When the deep notes of the organ sounded, everyone stood to sing. The first song was one of Addy's favorites. Auntie Lula had taught it to her back on the plantation. Now Addy sang out with the others in joy. "This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine." After a long prayer, Reverend Drake began his sermon. "I want to begin this morning by reading from the book of Luke. Turn to chapter 2, verses 6 and 7. Mama took a Bible from the rack on the pew in front of them. Addy helped her find the passage. Reverend Drake said, "This passage I'm about to read to you is about Mary and Joseph." Addy and Mama and the other members followed along as Reverend Drake read. "And she brought forth her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn." Now this is the story of Christmas, the story of the birth of Jesus. The time had come for Mary to give birth to Jesus. Let me tell you, people, time is a curious thing. It can't be stopped like a clock, Reverend Drake said. "You right, Reverend," one church member called out. "Time keeps right on moving, and I'm here to tell you the time for freedom has come for thousands of our people. These freed men are waiting right now in Washington, D.C. and other cities, and they need our help. Stay with me now," Reverend Drake preached. "Think with me, because I'm here to tell you this morning, freedom ain't free." A church member shouted back, "You preaching the truth." Addy scooted over closer to Mama and laid her head on Mama's shoulder. Mama put her arm around Addy and rocked gently on the pew. Addy liked coming to church. Anyone who wanted to could take part in the service. If you felt like answering the Reverend, you could. If you felt like crying or laughing or clapping to the music the choir sang, you could. Reverend Drake continued.
Some of you already know what I'm talking about, because there was a time when you came to freedom, and you found out what freedom was about. It wasn't free. You needed food to eat, clothes to wear, a place to stay.
Amen, Mama replied.
I'm here to tell you people, time ain't gonna stop for those thousands of freedmen who need our help. As I speak to you, babies are being born, and children are hungry, and mothers and fathers have no place to lay their heads at night. They need our help now, today, Reverend Drake said, his voice getting louder.
Addy looked up at Mama and saw tears running down her face. Addy gave Mama a little hug.
As we enter the season of Advent, the time of preparing for Christmas, let God work through you. When the collection boxes are passed this morning, remember to put in a little extra for our Freedmen's Fund. These people are your cousins, your brothers and sisters, your mothers and fathers, Reverend Drake said, pounding on the pulpit. It might mean you have to sacrifice. If you can't give of your money, give of your time. Next Saturday, a group of freedmen are coming in at the pier. Come help us welcome them to freedom. I close by saying, freedom can be a lonely walk through the wilderness and dark, but you can make a difference between a lonely night and one filled with light and hope.
On the way home from church, Mama and Addy walked hand in hand, humming This Little Light of Mine. Even though it was cold out, Addy felt a warm glow inside. I've been thinking about what Reverend Drake said this morning, said Mama slowly. He made me remember how it was for you and me when we first came to Philadelphia. We had nothing. The church helped us when we needed it. Now we done saved more than $1.50. The freedmen need our help right now. They need our savings more than we do. We can get along without a lamp, but they can't get along without help. What do you think? At first, Addy did not say anything. It was true. She and Mama could get along without the lamp, but they had saved so hard for it. A lamp would help her see better when she did her homework, and it would help Mama when she had to sew late at night. Addy could imagine how nice it would be to have a lamp when Sam and Papa and Esther returned, when their family was at last together again. She could picture their faces glowing in the bright light as they gathered around the dinner table. But then she remembered how scared and lonely she and Mama had been when they first came to Philadelphia, and how the church had helped them find work, a place to live, and friends. I think we should give our money to the church, Addy said. Other people helped us. The money might even help Sam or Papa or Esther come to us. Even if it don't, replied Mama, it's going to help somebody. That's what's important. She squeezed Addy's hand. We'll give the church our money next Sunday. With a pang of guilt, Addy remembered the 10 cents she had knotted up in her kerchief. Should she give that to help the freedmen too? No, thought Addy. I can't give that money away. It's for Mama's Christmas surprise. Addy decided to keep the money. She was determined to buy the scarf and show Mama how much she loved her. She would find another way to help the freedmen. Mama, she asked, can I go to the pier next Saturday to help out with the freedmen? I think that would be fine, Addy, said Mama, just so you finish all of Mrs. Ford's deliveries. I will, Mama, Addy promised. Chapter 4, The Cost of Freedom. When Addy arrived at the pier the next Saturday, Reverend Drake was already handing out old clothes and blankets to the people who had just gotten off the boat. Sarah and her mother were there, just as they had been when Addy and Mama arrived in Philadelphia last summer. Addy was glad to see them. What am I supposed to say to these folks? Addy asked Sarah. You ain't got to say nothing special, Sarah said. Just be yourself. I wish I could be like you, Addy said. When you met us, you made me feel like I was coming home. I was scared the day I met you, Sarah admitted. And look how good things turned out for us. The pier was slick with mud. Garbage floated in the dark, icy water, and the newly freed people huddled together in silent groups. They looked cold, frightened, hungry, and lost. Addy closed her eyes for a second. Esther, Sam, Papa, be here. Be here, Addy wished. But when she opened her eyes, there were no familiar faces in the crowd. Addy's heart sank. Just then she saw a thin woman who held a bundle in her arms. Addy heard a sharp cry. For a second, Addy thought it was Esther crying, and her heart started to pound. Then she saw a little hand reach up from the bundle. Quickly, Addy pulled her shawl from around her shoulders and handed it to the woman, who thanked her and wrapped the shawl around her baby. Addy held out her arms. "I can carry the baby if you like," she said. "I'll be careful." The woman smiled weakly. "Thank you kindly," she said. She handed the baby to Addy. Addy cradled the baby in her arms, just as she used to cradle Esther. The baby's eyes were bright as buttons. Addy held the baby close to her chest, hoping to warm her. The baby waved her arms and grabbed the cowrie shell necklace Addy wore around her neck. The baby's mother smiled. "She like you," she said. "She don't take a shine to just anybody." The woman rode back to the church in the wagon that Reverend Drake had brought, along with an old man who was coughing so hard his whole body shook. Another man in the wagon had been limping along with a stick he used as a crutch. His foot was bandaged in dirty rags. Addy looked at the poor, tired people who plodded along behind the wagon. Some had no shoes. Others wore tattered clothes. Addy held the baby closer to her, trying to keep her warm. "Where y'all from?" Addy asked the baby's mother. "We coming up from Baltimore," said the woman. "All the slaves on our plantation was turned out about a month ago. We was told we was free and we had to get, but we ain't had nowhere to go. No food, no nothing. Me and some others walked together. For a week we ate almost nothing but grass. We walked until we got to Baltimore." "Things gonna be better here," promised Addy. "The people at the church helped me and my mama. They'll help you too." When the wagon arrived back at church, Addy led the woman to Fellowship Hall in the basement. The big room was warm and dry and filled with the smell of delicious food. Many church members were there to help serve food to the freedmen. Addy remembered how happy she and Mama had been in this same place, eating their first warm meal in freedom on their first day in Philadelphia. She said goodbye to the woman. "You be safe now," she said. "People in the church gonna be your family." Addy hugged the baby one last time. Memories of Esther filled her mind, and she squeezed her eyes tight to stop the tears. Then Addy left to go to Mrs. Ford's. Back at the shop, there were more errands to do and 3 deliveries to make. Addy hurried along the busy streets. She saw women in fancy hats and fur coats carrying packages wrapped in bright paper. Usually Addy would have been fascinated with their fine clothes and fancy manners, but today they seemed silly. She remembered the people shivering at the pier. A man in a top hat strolled by, swinging a fine walking stick.